This is Kathy from Gadget Stop 321, and in today's video I'm going to be taking a look at Sailor Manyo Shirakashi. Now, this is looks like a nice, pleasant looking murky green. I'll be testing it in a variety of pins and nib sizes ranging from a Quebeco extra fine to a 1.5 stub nib. And I'm going to begin today with my little tweezer swatch that I do, since it takes the swatch a little bit longer to dry. Next, I'm going to do my little writing sample with my new glass dip pen. All right. It was pretty wet coming off the nib there at the beginning. And I'm going to begin with the Sailor Cool. It has a medium fine nib, but it writes finer, it puts down a finer line than the Quebeco extra fine. Okay. This isn't bad, but there are other fine nibs that I would prefer on Tomoe River paper. If I'm on Tomoe River paper, I prefer my Pilot fine nibs. They just write a little bit wetter and you see a little more of the character of the pen. So I'm going to say this is okay. There's better out there. That's acceptable. Next, I've got my Quebeco Skyline Sport with an extra fine nib. I can feel some feedback. It's not unpleasant, but I'm just going to say this one is also okay, but there's noticeable feedback. Again, if I wanted to use a finer nib, I think I could find something I prefer over the Quebeco Sport, at least for this type of paper. Next, I've got my TWSBI Mini with a fine nib. Now this is much better. This is smooth. And you can see it's a little bit wetter than the first two. And that's the problem I think I was having with these two. They were just a little too dry. So I like that. Next, I've got my Platinum 3776. I've really been enjoying this pen for these ink tests. It's been enjoyable to use on a variety of papers. It's not too wet and not too dry, just well tuned. I'm not going to classify this one as smooth. You feel a little bit of that feedback, but it's just enough that gives you some control in your writing. You're not slipping and sliding all over the page, so that is nice. And you're getting enough ink on the page that you can see the character of the ink and enjoy any special qualities it has. Next, I've got my Pilot Stargazer. Another one of my favorite pens. This is much wetter than the Platinum. Whereas the Platinum is better suited to use on a wider range of papers, this Stargazer, with it being so wet, it performs best on paper that you would consider fountain pen friendly, and it is very smooth. And finally, I've got my Genhowick 750 with a 1.5 stub nib. Now, I had to exert a little pressure there. Sometimes with this stub nib, with certain inks, if you don't exert enough pressure, if you use a light hand, it has trouble grabbing the page. And I kind of sensed that at the beginning with this one, so I had to put a little bit of pressure on the page to make sure it grabbed it. While that writing sample dries, I'm going to take a look at a couple other writing samples. On my Rhodia paper, I'm not seeing any sheen, but there's some nice shading. And on the finer nibs, kind of like on our Tomoe River paper, the finer nibs just weren't as pleasant. They felt a little dry on the page, but starting with the TWSBI Mini, they were nice and smooth, and I just liked the way the ink looked on the page as well. On my copy paper, the fine nibs were actually pretty enjoyable to use. Now, sometimes on copy paper, your ink just looks kind of bland, and you're not going to see shading. But with these fine nibs, it's probably not going to show up as well on camera. But this is just a nice dark hunter green. If you want to substitute something for a black, but still have something a little bit different, I kind of like this, and it was nice in the two fine nibs. Now, just using a fine nib is not a guarantee that it's going to perform like this, because my Pilot Custom 74 is a pretty wet writer, and this ink does tend to feather. And these wetter nibs, there was some feathering. So if you have a dry fine nib, like these two, the LaCool and the Quebeco Sport, it was enjoyable to write on this paper. I was surprised. Even the TWSBI Mini was nice to use on both types of paper. It was wet enough and smooth enough that it was enjoyable to use on the Tomoe River, but it's not as wet as like the Platinum or the Pilot, and it was still nice to use on copy paper. And it didn't bleed through the paper terribly bad. It didn't bleed too bad, but it is a feathering ink, so it worked well in drier nibs. In my Leuchtturm, my little writing sample that I did, let's see, sometimes if there's sheen, it'll show up on this Leuchtturm paper, and I'm not seeing any sheen, but the shading is just really nice. I like it. It's nice for this time of year, instead of a bright green that's kind of appealing to use in the springtime. That's a nice dark green. And let's see, on the Tomoe River, this is, if you have a wet enough nib, you will see just some hints of sheen. It's not like a super sheen or anything, but it gives your writing just the hint of interest, and I don't know how well, it's probably not going to show up on camera, but this isn't a bad ink. It's nothing super exciting, just I would call it just a nice dark green. All right. If you found this video helpful, please give me a thumbs up, and if you'd like to see more videos like this, please subscribe to my channel.